Well, we flew back. I had a lot of material. And in the meantime, things started unfolding. We're now well into 68. Started to unfold into an ever more divided movement. As I repeat, to use the word the movement by 68 is naive. You had several movements of the kind that I've already described, MOB, the radicals in general, then the radicals divided between the Marxist-Leninists, the anarchists, motherfuckers who I really think should be dealt with in a very scrupulous way, and the Trotskyists. So you had these major divisions. When finally, during all the assassinations that took place in 68 occurred, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, black uprisings all over the country, which did not directly affect us in New York City, by the way. We had to take counsel with ourselves, my group, and not just my group, people who were very friendly toward us, and ask ourselves what was needed. What was needed was a coherent movement. I don't mean monolithic. I don't mean one that wasn't divided into factions, but one that had a common sense of purpose. And above all, that recognized, and this was very important, that America was not any more than France was in a revolutionary situation. If we were not even in what classical Marxists would call the pre-revolutionary situation, we had yet to win the American people to us. The great majority either looked at us as crazy or well-meaning, or, depending upon which way you want to look at it, moving to the right, increasingly crazy and dangerous. Great demonstrations reaching 500,000 in Washington. But what did that mean when people went home and didn't do anything afterward? Okay, they just got themselves recorded on film and had their spree. What was happening? Was there a movement growing out of this that could change the society? And we knew that this movement would have to have stamina. This was terribly important, and that's why our study groups are important. It had to have staying power. And every movement was like a revolving door. People went in and out of movements. It was incredible. They went in and out of SDS the way people went in and out of a rotating door, you know. These doors that turn around. You didn't see the same faces at the same meetings sometimes. Nothing of an educational value was being developed. Everything was action, 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 until the word action, faction, became the code word for describing where different segments of the so-called movement were going. Nothing deep. Everything was sort of skin deep. Nothing deep was penetrating into the minds of people. And it was very important to reach ordinary Americans who didn't understand what was happening. From their point of view, we were just the movement. The movement was throwing the whole country into chaos. And people wanted stability. They didn't want chaos. They weren't starving to death. The blacks were terribly deprived. And understandably, they wanted to get a part of the action, so to speak, economically speaking. But they were not revolutionaries. Workers hated us. They felt that we wanted to close down war production plants. There was a real conflict about that, just like in environmental movements today. They didn't want to see their various air bomber planes, factories being closed down. They didn't want to see war production come to an end. That was their bread and butter. And we were against the war that provided them with bread and butter. In the meantime, you know, the American army seemed to be disintegrating too. You know, officers couldn't rely on whether or not they'd get a bullet in their back or whether they were loved by their troops. Fragging, as it was called, namely putting a hand grenade in an officer's tent while he was asleep, was becoming more and more common, and we knew about that. Word was coming back about that. So, stated very bluntly, the need for a coherent movement was important that took full recognition of the way, try to find ways and means to communicate with the American people, and to recognize, unlike the action faction, that we were not on the point of a revolution, that we were not even near a revolution, that we had not even won the country, that people were puzzled at best and hateful at worst. And the object was to explain what the counterculture was trying to do, the utopian vision of communal living, sharing, of the free sexuality, of, as time grew on, the emancipation of women completely, of changing the whole workplace, giving it an entirely different meaning, of using the enormous wealth of America to satisfy everybody's needs and contribute in funding to satisfy the needs of the third world, to bring the war to an end, of course, but above all, a basic social vision. And we were stressing ecology at a time when ecology was an unknown word, that we being the anarchos group with which I was working, it was turning out this magazine. And we issued these statements. So we had to fight almost everybody in the movement. Why? The motherfuckers went crazy altogether. They were the most representative anarchists, I would say, in the United States. And they were into violence, violence, violence. The main theme that they advanced was that the students are shit. They're middle-class shit, and we have to get together with young workers and blacks. The blacks didn't want them, because they were not pro-white, to put it mildly, and were moving more and more into a parochialized ethnic situation. The young workers didn't want them because the young workers were benefiting from war production. And they were beating up on peace demonstrators. But this imaginary image of what reality was like totally obsessed the motherfuckers. And this one movement that was active, the students, they regarded as petty bourgeois shit. And they told the students that. Yet they were a street branch of the of SDS. So when they went to SDS conventions, what their main job was to break up the meeting. Instead of bringing the meeting together, espousing a position, creating serious discussion, play an educational role, be constructive, and create a solid base inside SDS, which by that time, especially after the Chicago events during the Democratic Convention, led to the flooding of SDS. SDS became the largest radical movement since I don't know when. People, in reaction to the police brutality of the Chicago cops during the Democratic Convention, so antagonized people who were viewing these cries, the whole world is watching. They were crying out there in great crowds as the cops were smashing them up. National Guardsmen were putting it, were blocking off streets. Mayor Daley was behaving like a Hitler, not in reality, but to all appearances, you know. So SDS was the place to be. SDS had to be saved. SDS had to be given a sense of direction while all these factions were eating away at it, and most of them, incidentally, even themselves had no sense of direction. The Maoists simply wanted to gain members out of SDS. Their program went back to 1934. It was hot news in 1934, but it wasn't worth a damn thing in 1968. The Trotskys had their true, tried and tested program, which had been fossilized since Trotsky died in 1940. He was assassinated in 1940. They were as sectarian as could be. The communists, of course, were non-existent. They were living in their own world. The Black Panthers were doing their strutting and exercising and were being infiltrated by the FBI on a scale so that you didn't know who the hell you were talking to if you were talking to a Panther. They flooded the Panthers with agents, you know, informers. Berkeley was going crazy with revolutionary hysteria, okay. And the counterculture was drifting more and more toward mysticism. The I Ching, Lao Tzu, Buddhism, and so on, although it was still quite radical. But the two were really moving apart. They had managed to come together somewhat around 1966, 67, but now they were beginning to separate. And the motherfuckers who had one of the most important footholds in SDS, and in my opinion could have very well decided its future, was stupid enough to make a deal with Bernardine Dawn and Mike Klonsky, the two honchos of SDS. Bernardine was later to become the female honcho of the Weathermen, to keep PL in at a time when the membership wanted PL to be expelled, which should have been the case, because PL was an exogenous group. They came from outside in order to harvest what they could, after which, if they couldn't control SDS, they would have destroyed it, or they would have absorbed it into PL, Progressive Labor, a Maoist organization. So I remember when Ben Morea spoke to me about this and said that he made this deal, I said, are you mad? Are you insane? I practically said, get the hell out of my house. I said, you should have fostered the expulsion of PL. They weren't in there to build SDS. They were in there to parasitize SDS. And when young people jumped up at one of the conferences in mass yelling, PL out, PL out, PL out, they weren't expelled because of this unholy alliance between Dawn, Klonsky, and Morea et al. And other people. I don't want to sit around, you know what I mean, in judgment, a distance of all these years, but it was a disastrous move. Then afterward, the motherfuckers got out of PL. They left it, became a street gang, and ostensibly were protecting hippies. And they've all gone their own different ways. One guy was killed holding up a bank, not a bank, a liquor store. And I wouldn't call this a political act. It was an attempt to carry the tradition over into the criminal realm. Another one became a millionaire. Don't care to mention his name. It's his own business. Still others drifted off into artistic endeavors and finally all disappeared. Alan Hoffman, who had been very close to me and had become a motherfucker, was killed in a terrible accident in Route 1 in Redwood, Humboldt County somewhere. Had his brain smashed out because he landed on the road, sliding off the back of a flatbed truck. Things were coming to a head, and finally I was urged by all the people in our group, which used to go to all the SDS conferences, and SDS met 4 times a year. One was its Congress, and the other 3 meetings, which were also national, were called NICs, National Interim Conferences, which they hashed out ideas. And our people would keep going there and giving out literature so that our name was relatively well known. The old leadership was being supplanted by an entirely new leadership. Guys like Tom Hayden were no longer in there. Guys like, all the old ones. One of them in particular I especially like. His name will come to me, but I can't confess to have the memory of a youngster anymore.
Davidson?
Huh?
Davidson?
No, Carl Davidson became a crazy Maoist altogether, and I was told by, give me another name if you please, not Carl Davidson, his buddy. Davidson went into the Guardian and became a crazy Maoist. Stanley Aronowitz and I debated him and Erwin Silber, and the one thing that Davidson could say in the debate was that nothing has changed since Lenin died. Greg Calvert, yeah. Both he and Greg Calvert were among the educational directors of SDS, and they brought in Andre Gortz's crazy book, New Strategy for Labor, to indoctrinate these young people into the idea that they were proletarians, which was poison. It was like a shot of lethal. It was like a lethal injection, you see. And I'll never forget Greg sitting in my house, finishing off a quart of vodka, and saying, I'm responsible for the Weathermen. Me and Carl Davidson brought in this idea that they should become Marxists, think in Marxist categories. I feel responsible. He's finishing off this whole vodka until finally he passed out. And the next day he went off when I woke up and he wasn't there anymore. He's now telling his own cock and bull stories about me and the motherfuckers as though I and the motherfuckers were working cheek to jowl with each other instead of arguing almost every time we met. But then the motherfuckers pulled out and drifted off to the West Coast, disbanded, and I told you that various people of theirs, shall we say, got into different lines of work. And they disappeared. I don't know what's happened to them now. It was necessary for us to intervene in the SDS convention. One was slated for June 1969. It was to be the last SDS convention. It was to be the peak of SDS and the end of SDS. That convention was held in Chicago. Now, I had written a special pamphlet within 4 days called Listen, Marxist. And I put everything I had into it just like that. I wrote it like the spirit had entered me. Fiery, vitriolic, analytical, okay? Using Marx against the Marxists, everything, explaining what the anarchist approach was. And it was really a tempestuous pamphlet. And we had a very dear friend of ours, Jim Lanier, who I shall always look back with love and affection. He was almost a hillbilly from North Carolina, had come up north, and who became an excellent printer. He had printed a leaflet of ours in 1954 called Stop the Bomb, the one that I wrote, that I told you about. And he was working at that time in a major university whose name shall remain unknown, which had a big kind of newsprint type of press, the kind that you would expect to find, I guess, in the Daily News or the New York Times, huge rollers of paper and everything. He took the pamphlet, and I designed a cover for it with a picture of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao, and Bugs Bunny right in the middle eating a carrot, and said, "Listen, Marxist." And I didn't put my name on it. I just said the anarchist group. And he ran off 7,000 of them in like 3 hours. Stapled them, they were put in cartons and packed it. We put them in a truck. I took a bus to Chicago while they and their truck were following along with us. I couldn't get in. The truck was filled up with our literature. So 3,000 copies of Listen, Marxist, God knows what, pamphlets, everything like that. And we came to Chicago, and they had a convention hall in Chicago. Now that convention hall looked like a huge armory, and a second story to it, and nothing but steel girders or whatever. It was barren and empty and loud, and you could yell and get an echo from all different 4 sides of it. And I had about 2,000 people coming in. SDS had gone wacky. They decided no reporters were going to be allowed, which meant that the reporters got in there, but when they reported everything that people wanted to hear about SDS, namely that the organization was totally confused, Marxist, dangerous, you name it. You couldn't get in without being searched. They took away my pearl-handled penknife, and I never got it back, so you always had to be searched. We had the cops everywhere, whether we knew it or not. They came in plain clothes. The immigration service came in and was looking for people who were Europeans whom they could pick up and kick out of the country, and a couple of them that I know were kicked out. They had reporters, of course, and the whole place was wired for whatever they wanted to hear. And they had cops with cameras, plain clothes, patently patently police agents who were out to get your photograph. And this is a very common thing that happened. I had people draw up to me, not in Chicago, but in New York, and take a photograph of me and step right back into a car again. Well-dressed, nattily dressed like FBI agents. So, we laid out a big table. We got the support of the industrial workers of the world, the old headquarters that go way back to before the First World War. All along the way were the old bookcases with glass covers on them, mahogany, the old banners, the old pictures, but it could seat easily about 300 people. And we started giving out our literature. Now, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin had shown up at our faction meetings in New York. Me and Abby got along in a very strange way. We interacted a hell of a lot in different ways. And there's a story to be told about that, because there's a whole mythology about poor old Abby. And he and Jerry Rubin came up to our meetings, which were held in B's apartment, my former wife's apartment, in University Heights, by the way, down by NYU, New York University. And whenever he'd walk in, there'd be a whole trail of about 4 or 5, 7, 8 people, half of whom looked like cops. I'm not joking. Half of whom looked like cops. And they'd sit themselves down and we'd start wondering, what the hell should we talk about with these people who were quite likely to be police agents? So we'd carry on our conversations in a more desultory fashion, although we had nothing really to hide. I mean, we were out in the open. It was a very strong policy of mine not to get involved in the crazy escapades of the 60s. So we had nothing to hide. And Abby would be coming up there. And finally, when we got to the convention center, and Jerry, there was Abby and Jerry giving out our leaflets, and we drew up a document, the Radical Decentralist Project. And loading our table up with Listen Marxists and with our Radical Decentralist Project, we decided to run candidates. And among the candidates I think we ran was James Miller, the guy who's written The Passion of Michel Foucault and stuff on the Port Huron Statement. And we were either going to run him for a candidate, I'm not at all sure. We wanted to get the floor, so we had to put up a slate of candidates to be able to talk to those 2,000 crying, screaming, shouting kids out there. And so he was part of our group, and there were many others. And bit by bit, as people began to get Listen Marxist, they started coming up to us and telling us what a terrific pamphlet it was, especially the next day of the convention. They read it, and before long, we were out of all 2,000 of these pamphlets. We gave them away for nothing. And we had a tremendous impact upon that convention, because I think we did a great deal to weaken the influence of the wild Marxist-Leninist groups at that particular time. The convention itself turned out to be a bit of a madhouse. Everybody came in with Mao Zedong red books. And when anyone took the floor and people got angry at what they said, they'd start throwing all their red books sailing across the air at the speaker. And finally, Black Panthers came in, and one of them got up there and started talking about pussy power. So every goddamn red book in the place flew in the direction of the microphone, and the Panthers sort of withdrew. In the meantime, inviting people to our caucus, we found that we had about 250, which may have been as close to 10% of the delegates. We called ourselves the Radical Decentralist Project, and we wrote a full-page statement, which has since been reprinted without knowing where it came from, in which we called for SDS to recognize that it was a student movement and not a workers' movement, and to work among students, and to take the path of least resistance to reach those people who would be most susceptible to the ideas of SDS. We called for an organization oriented toward American problems, not only third world problems, and try to speak to the American people. And we had practically 10% of the delegation. Now, if you read most books about SDS, you'll read that there was the Weatherman faction, which was RIM 1, Revolutionary Youth Movement 1. And you'll read about another faction, Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, which I couldn't quite separate in my mind from RIM 1, but Mike Klonsky, who headed that faction, went into the Communist Party and they dissolved. RIM 1 later became Weatherman. And then you'd hear that there was PL, Progressive Labor. So you know of only 3 factions. And of course, Kirkpatrick Sale, who's about as reliable, you know what I mean, as a butterfly, and who never had been, to my knowledge, in SDS and was mainly combing through documents. His book was utterly dead in terms of conveying the life of SDS, its vitality. It's one of the most vital radical movements to appear in the United States. Reads like a deadpan dossier. And all he knows is that my pamphlet was there. He doesn't know that there was that other faction, the Radical Decentralist faction, which was meeting in the Industrial Workers of the World Hall, called the Radical Decentralist Project. And we had a whole bunch of candidates we were going to put up so that we could give our position and argue our position. That was the only way we could do it, by running candidates, argue our position before the membership of SDS, and see if there were any rational people who would break away from these crazy dogmatic sectarian groups in which middle-class white students were pretending to be black industrial workers, which they were not. Well, finally, we heard suddenly that while we were still holding one of our meetings and we didn't think anything was happening up at the IWW hall, we heard that the Panthers had come back again, and they demanded that PLP be expelled. And bingo, the convention was thrown wide open. When we came back the next day in the morning, went through our usual search and came in there, we found that there was an adjacent auditorium hall at right angles to the big giant convention hall that formed an L. And we were in the long part of the L, and there was the short part of the L, with great big fire doors that could be opened and closed. And the fire doors were partly opened with 2 squadristas, you know, searching us and asking us our credentials. They wouldn't let anyone from Progressive Labor in. Because what Progressive Labor had done, to my knowledge, and to the best of my recollection, is that they had bussed in ordinary people to pack the meeting in order to take control of the organization. And they were organized in squads where a real valid PLP member would tell them what to do, to yell, to scream, to sit, to shout, to vote, to whatever to do, while the others were innocents who had been taken in by this idea of a worker-student alliance and did not fully understand the extent to which PLP, this Maoist organization, was controlling them. And I knew about tactics like that back in the 30s when the communists used to do that. We did, I'm ashamed to say, but then I was a kid. I was younger than they were in that convention. I was a teenager, or even earlier than that. So I was admitted into this new convention hall, and that was filled up. And Jeff Jones, that blonde-haired former motherfucker who now had become a weatherman, or was to become a weatherman chieftain, stood there in front of the whole group, and he says, "I hereby declare the opening of the Real Students for a Democratic Society convention. Who wants the floor?" So I raised my hand. I was given the floor immediately. So I started to try to give our program. And I'm getting all these right on, right on. I wasn't familiar with the word right on in those days. I must tell you that. We didn't use it that much in New York. It was basically something that came from California to the east, or maybe it was part of the black ghetto movements. Right on, it should be. Then another guy comes down and tries to say the very opposite of what I'm saying, and they're yelling, right on, right on. So I gave up. I knew that there was nothing we could do except organize an alternative student movement.
What was the basic line behind your talk?
The basic line behind my talk was basically that we did not have the support of the American people at this point. We had to win it. We had to go through a whole educational campaign to try to win Americans over to our ideas. We had to know what our ideas were, clarify them. I tried to give a libertarian thrust to the ideas. We're anti-authoritarian. I tried to point out we had to deal with a wider range of problems than just the war itself, important as the war was, which is not to deny the importance of the war, and that we had to give a vision. We had to offer a vision. We couldn't just sit around and say, America with 3 Ks in the middle instead of a C. Americans were not going to listen to that. We had to pick up on American radical traditions. We couldn't talk to them in Mao's Chinese. We couldn't, important, whatever it may have been for China, it didn't mean anything to Americans. We couldn't talk to them in Lenin's Russian, with all the stock phrases that Lenin uses. Understandable in Russia at that time, but not here, 69, in the United States. And remember, Nixon had been elected president of the United States in 69. We couldn't talk to them in Cuba's Spanish, maybe to the Spanish. They wouldn't have liked Cuba anyway. We couldn't talk to them, many of them were exiles. We couldn't talk to them in the Marxist German. It didn't mean anything to talk about the hegemonic role of the proletariat. What did that mean? Our real place, if they were a student organization, was on the campus. And there were campuses all over America, I argued. There were 7 million students, college students in the United States. SDS chapters on many of these college students on many of these campuses could reach out to the most remote parts of the country that we couldn't even reach out to in the 30s. And that became very clear later on, as you'll see. I got nowhere. I hung around Chicago with our group, and we went back. And then we decided that we would call, as soon as possible, another convention. We had a lot of names of branches, SDS chapters throughout the country that were interested in coming. As far away as Mississippi, California, Maine, you name it. And we arranged it with one Jerk, who was in our group, who's basically an administrator, to set things up so that if the SDS convention, which fell apart in June '69, came to its final end, bringing SDS down completely. Because once the Weathermen decided to go off on their own, Rim 1 and Rim 2 going in different directions, PLP was finally isolated. It was left to itself. So an arrangement was made to hold a conference in the summer, I think around the August, only 2 months later, at Black River, which is a camping area and state park in Wisconsin. We had very good friends in Madison, Wisconsin, who were prepared to help us. And I remember even talking at Madison at that time to students. And I think I helped at the founding conference of a group that was calling for Progressive Science Organization. I forgot the name of it already. My stuff was being printed. I'm speaking only of myself. It was being printed in the Madison's college paper, which is a daily. And so we were all set to go, say, give or take 80 miles north to Black River in Wisconsin from Madison. And when we got there, we had a camping ground. Well, I would have wanted it indoors so we could meet. We didn't have it that way. A big tent was erected to accommodate X numbers of people. I don't mean a little one. I mean a great big canvas circus type tent. Somebody flew up a black flag for what that was worth. All we needed was for the police to see it. We would have been kicked out of the campground. We tried to form a conference. We sat around in the usual circle, hundreds of us, I would guess. And we started a discussion. And that unstructured phenomenon is deadly. Because everybody went around, didn't want to, each one had his or her own agenda. So you'd say something, and that something required a response. you didn't get a response. Somebody would say something different, and somebody would say something different, and before long, 50, 60, 100 different things were being said, none of which were responded to, so there was no dialogue, there was no working out of anything. In the meantime, the Chinook, who had organized this logistics for this conference, had his own agenda. He was being influenced somewhat, I would say, by the Situationists, and he believed in expressing sensual desire. Got to know what a problem that is, because we've got it running in the so-called anarchist movement today, the lifestyle anarchists, no organization, no program, no politics, express your desire, R.D. Lang, Wilhelm Reich, the erection is all that counts, more important than the clenched fist. Through desire we will transform the world, through art we will transform the world. He himself, by the way, was as stiff and as wooden as could be. He'd been trained as an engineer. And he was calling people away to call his own little conference on desire, which probably would have led to a sexual orgy if he had his way. And I began to see people fading away. And before long, I couldn't make out what the hell was happening. After going through some more shenanigans like that, I finally fractured my foot. I was running down a hill, and I fractured my ankle. It was just one of these twists that really broke it. And thank God, as I began to sense what was happening, I got the hell out of there. And many of the serious people there were terribly shaken and disappointed and went home. Black flag and no black flag, if you allow me. And still further, I now had to get a cast put on me. I had to go home by plane. I got the hell out. I wanted to get out. The other guy who started this little sub-conference of his own based on desire took off to California, and I wasn't to see him for years. It's typical of the kind of situation one began to run into in the 60s. So, at that point, it was very plain that we had to You see, what had happened was that we were told throughout the country that the underground press, which had 5 million readers, a large part of it was waiting for us to come out with a statement. All we had to do was publish this statement in the underground press, at least those newspapers that were very receptive to us, and they were major newspapers, that's to say that had thousands and thousands of readers. We could have started a ball rolling to countervail the breakup of SDS, to provide an alternative based on our basic left libertarian principles, and all that I had essentially said when I spoke at the SDS convention. It was not to be. I'm sorry to say that there are lifestyle anarchoids, if I may use that expression, who believe that you can't write a statement, that everybody has to put in a verb, a noun, an adjective, and so on, or else it's not a collective statement. So it was never written. We had a good statement available. It was the anarcho statement of our periodical. It could have started out, well, who we are, what we want, what we stand for. And then just add a few lines on saying we offer an alternative to the breakup of SDS. We could have called it the Student Libertarian League. Students for a Libertarian Society, right? The word libertarian as yet had not quite acquired the enormous right-wing proprietarian connotations that it had. The word libertarian had been invented in Paris by Élisée Reclus in the 1890s. It belonged to the anarchists, not to the proprietarians. But the utmost individualism, and this is a terrible lesson to be learned, and if it isn't learned, there's no future for a left, at least the libertarian left, of the kind that one would want to draw from on the great traditions of the 19th century, I'll tell you that now. And that is that we, as a movement, if we want to create a new society, have to build a movement to do that. It's not going to happen out of the air. It's not going to happen because everybody feels a strong impulse of desire and libidinal drives, especially in the era of AIDS, if you forgive me, when you have to put a condom on, somehow the spontaneity may very well go out of it all. It's not going to come from an aesthetic vanguard, you know. It's going to paint its way through great paintings into a revolution. It's not going to start by blowing people's minds. I'll tell you why. People want stability. It takes all that you can do to get them to innovate. And it's going to take more compelling reasons than street theater and antics and wild lunacy and disorganization for its own sake. And on pure spontaneity, as though people have a revolutionary instinct. People do not have a revolutionary instinct. They have a survival instinct. And they try to adapt in Auschwitz, and they try to adapt everywhere. And I feel sorry for all the victims of that. But still, people try to make out before they actually begin to change. And it takes some kind of stimulus, intellectual, organizational, to get them in motion and to give a sense of direction to what would otherwise turn out not to be an insurrection or a revolution or anything you want, but that would turn out to be a genuine historical change. And this, I don't feel in any way countervails my libertarian views. The Spanish anarchists were organized right down to their toenails. They didn't make mistakes because they were organized. They made mistakes, in my opinion, because they weren't educated. See, they were super military and militant and very, very well organized. But the intellectual level, the theoretical level of the Spanish anarchist movement was basically that of what? Land, peace, and bread? Or, you know, all power to the confederations? Beyond that, you know, without a thoroughly educated movement, or at least a movement reasonably well educated, and not bureaucratized, and not centralized, but confederated, we get nowhere. And we got nowhere. And that's the big lesson that I'd like to say about the 60s in concluding this. What am I going to learn from the 60s? Well, to begin with, there was no revolutionary situation in the 60s. There was a chance to change people's consciousness. And one of the most important tasks would have been to try to change that consciousness, and to do that with a movement that would educate. And that consciousness had to be changed in a way that was critical. Critical. In the sense that it was critical of the society, of its institutions, of its irrationalities. There had to be a recognition on the part of radicals in the 60s that they had a long task ahead of them. It was not going to happen in 6 months. You know, the biggest thing that I encountered among the revolutionaries, quotes, close quote, in the 60s was the idea that the revolution was going to take place in 6 months. Ben Morea once sat down and told me, we've got 20 million blacks. Like hell he had 20 million blacks. We have 40 million poor. Like hell he had 40 million poor. We have 7 million students. Like hell he had 7 million students. And so on until he practically counted up the whole population. And I said, well, why don't you have the revolution already? I said, you got more people on your side than there are in the United States right now. Who's left to fight you? Nixon or at that particular point Johnson? And that kind of absurdity existed that we have. Blacks were fighting, as understandably they would, for a better life for themselves. They weren't fighting capitalism. Only a few were. The Black Panthers made fools of themselves, ultimately. I'm sorry to say that, but half of their membership or leadership was made up of FBI informers. We now know that. The Trotskyists were living back in 1930. They were living back in 1917. And the Maoists were just going nuts altogether and quickly became right-wingers in many cases. So there was a hell of a lot of theater, stemming out of the very affluence of the society, stemming out of the post-scarcity potential of that society, and the tensions that existed between an old world that was passing and a new world like in De Gaulle, was coming into being. And that tension produced the crisis. With that opened an opportunity to provide an educational experience with the American people that in time, long time, well beyond my own lifetime, and I was much younger then, obviously, by 20 years, could have led to a genuine left. Instead, it was frittered away in theater. Theater. It was pure theater. People were riding on and right on and right on. They may have stopped the war in Vietnam, which was a stupid war, even from the standpoint of the bourgeoisie. What the hell did they have to get by taking Vietnam? You know? That wasn't the point. They had to prove their prestige, that no little so-called two-bit country in Asia could challenge America's superpower. So they stuck it out, made a mess of it, and pulled out, and that's it. And then afterward, things began to go down. No organization. An economic crisis began to develop. The Kent shootings, students at Kent University in 1970. I was crossing the country at that time, talking everywhere. I left Ohio only 2 weeks before the Kent shootings. I was up in Colorado. General strike of the students. And then everything went flat. The students found out after the shootings that when they went home on vacation, their parents told them, "We wish you were shot too." What are you bothering these poor soldiers for? You brought it on yourself. You should have been killed also. Students told me that their parents told them that. I talked to ordinary people, being an older guy, in the cafeteria, you know, workers, farmers, in Arizona. I said, "What do you think of this killing that went on in Kent?" I mean, you know what the principal answer was? They didn't kill enough of them. Actually, Charlie Reich's book, The Greening of America, tried to establish some rapport with Americans about what the counterculture and the new left were trying to do. The book was condemned by the super ultra-revolutionaries who are now dentists, accountants, doctors, and mainly professors, as being too liberal. What the hell did they want to tell Americans? Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, dare to struggle, dare to win. That is the real 60s. The myth and the reality. The reality was that there was a marvelous opportunity to change consciousness in America. The myth is that it was supposed to be a revolutionary moment. It was not. Whether in France, Germany, or most clearly in the United States. And I want to tell that to people because there are lessons that have to be learned out of that. The need for organization, the need for education, going right back to where we began, the study group. And the need to change consciousness. And to have the right consciousness. And to have organization. And to be prepared, as a teacher would with a student, to provide leadership, not to manipulate, but to show a sense of direction. Without that, the left will be dead. And for all I know, looking back over time, in all the years that I've been in the left, I don't know what the future of the left will be, and I'll never know because I'm too old to find out. That's it. Or as Bugs Bunny said, that's it, folks.
There is a view promulgated by the right wing and often by former workers who have achieved a level of affluence that one of the key problems with U.S. industry is labor unions. The labor unions started making too many demands on the factory owners, on the multinationals, and labor unions have driven the economy down. They have driven corporations out of the United States into third world countries. Can you respond to that point of view?
Well, if that's the case, then that point of view wants us to become like the third world countries. In other words, live in poverty, live in squalor, be overexploited, and be humiliated by arrogant corporations and their managers. If that's the worst thing that labor has done to prevent us from becoming that, being reduced to that, then all I would suggest is that we need labor unions more more extensively than ever before. In fact, more precisely, they should be extended to the third world countries to equalize the situation, namely to improve the standard of living of third world workers. I'm outraged by that kind of remark. Implicit in that remark is that if we didn't have labor unions, we would be able to drive working conditions, income, and everything else down to the level of a third world country, which in turn, of course, as we all know, is being exploited by capitalists, multinational. You know, why use the word multinational corporations as well? I'm sick and tired of hearing that this is an industrial society when in fact it's a capitalist society that has more industry than before. I'm weary of hearing multinational corporations when we're talking about a predatory capitalist pirates, you see, very much in the tradition, in their own way, of Gould, the great railroad magnate, who claimed that he could hire half of the working class to destroy the other half. You know, the Rockefellers of the early part of this century and the latter part of the last century. Let's call them what the hell they are. This is not an industrial society alone. It's a capitalist society that is particularly well equipped with industrial technology. I want to insist upon the correct use of words here, even though it seems that I'm sidetracking the issue for a moment. These are not simply multinational corporations. They're called corporations that have extended out to other areas or other nations of the world. But they're still the same old predatory sharks that they were, quite as bad as they were in the 19th century, when everybody visibly knew a beastly capitalist for what he normally was. So let's call it what it is, this thinking capitalist society, and I feel very strongly about this use of terminology. Nor are we in a post-industrial society. It's another pile of linguistic or semantic hogwash. You know, everybody's trying to cover up the evils of the society with benign language. Okay? Now, getting back to labor unions. Labor unions are responsible for the fact that American products do not sell well, or American industry is not as effective, whatever that word means, namely profit making, because labor unions have kept wages too high or have made working conditions too good. By the way, they're not too high and they're not too good, labor unions or not. And hence, third world countries or other parts of the world which are less, quotes, industrialized, owing to the lower wages that the multinationals pay people in the third world, and owing to the appalling working conditions, the free hand in polluting in the environment, and the low quality and standard of life, are responsible, have given an edge to these areas. Well, if labor unions have done that, then all I can say is that we need a trade union international that will finally raise the standard of living of people in third world countries or in people in non-unionized jobs up to the level that hopefully trade unions have achieved. I say this is a moral issue, not because I think that trade unions are going to be the salvation of society. I say this because, first of all, I'm offended by the hypocrisy of such statements. The implication of such statements, particularly when they're made by affluent people, and especially people whose affluence, I'm talking of former workers, has been acquired through trade unions. I doesn't say without these unions they wouldn't be affluent, can now turn their backs on the very sources of their affluence and condemn trade unions for making American, quotes, industry, let's put it frankly, capitalism, less competitive, another fiction, by the way, that we can go into, incidentally, because in other areas, workers are, in effect, providing labor at such low wages, or forced to provide labor at such wages, that these other people can be affluent. Outrages me. It simply outrages me. It outrages me when I hear of a worker. I've been in 5 trade unions in my life. I know a great deal about the trade union movement, and I've studied labor history with as meticulously as anyone could who has been in the radical movement. The trade unions were established in the United States with great pain and bloodshed. There are people who died to create trade unions, people who were shot in their efforts to create a trade union movement. I'm shocked by the fact that from George Meany onward, or Philip Murray onward in the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, not to speak of the American Federation of Labor, which was never great shakes to begin with, that there has been such a repellent complicity between trade union leaders and capitalists. They're the very people they're supposed to be in an adversarial relationship with. That bothered me. And through the whole Cold War, George Meany, the head of the AFL/CIO, literally became an instrument of American Cold War policy, and with very close connections to the CIA in spreading a trade union movement in Europe and elsewhere in the world that would be more favorable to American foreign policy and American colonialism, or to use a more appropriate word, American imperialism, which is not to say that other countries didn't have their own imperialism as well. So I have a lot of criticism of trade unions. Not trade unions as such, but trade union leaderships. I don't believe that the trade union movement, as the anarcho-syndicalists might believe, even in a libertarian form, will redeem us and form the foundations for a new libertarian, anarcho-communist society. But what I do resent is the immorality of attacking the unions, of all things. They attack the unions, who have been trying to, at least in order to satisfy their membership, leadership having to satisfy its membership, producing high costs, or causing American products to be priced out of the market, because third world countries or multinationals that establish themselves in third world countries can get labor for 10 cents, 20 cents, or $1 an hour, which might otherwise cost them, give or take, $10 an hour in the United States or $15 an hour. I'm shocked by a view so inane, so immoral, so indecent, in fact, so evil, to be very honest with you. First, I am all the more appalled when I hear that affluent workers today, who have risen either up to the levels of management or have retired and now sit and read the Wall Street Journal and check out their various securities on the stock market because trade unions made it possible for them to get the income to enjoy these retirements. I'm shocked when I hear workers or ex-workers or bourgeoisified workers now, on retirement incomes and incomes earned from the stock market or mutuals and so on and so forth, sit around, carping against trade unions. The very trade unions, incidentally, quite frequently, that brought them to this affluent position. So that's all the more indecent in my mind. But very important is the fact that one must realize the implications of such a statement. If high standards of life in the United States achieved through trade union activities, more pleasant working conditions achieved through trade union activities, have resulted in American products being too costly, then what's the implication? The implication is that we should get rid of the trade unions, drive down the living standards of workers today, pay them less so that they can compete with Mexican workers. This is in no way derogatory of Mexican workers, by the way, who I feel are victims in this whole situation, or Latin American workers generally, or wherever it is that these predatory sharks called industrialists and entrepreneurs go to establish their profitable firms and relocate. I would suggest that some of the more affluent people now who are living off the gains of the trade union movement, kindly give up their mutual stocks and divest themselves accordingly and live on a third world basis if they're against trade unions. Or else the alternative is, and this I would say is a very pleasant alternative. Bring trade unions to Mexico. Bring them up to the level of American workers, income level of American workers. Bring them to Africa, to the rest of Latin America, to Asia, and everywhere else. Okay, and then there won't be, if the trade union, as I indicated, a trade union international could be established, it will do exactly that. Raise the whole level of everybody's wages. Then what have we got to worry about? But remember what the implications, what the unspoken message of denouncing trade unions really consists of. Driving American living standards down to third world living standards, and working conditions, and pollution, and everything that goes along with it. I'm shocked by that claim. I can understand capitalists have everything to gain. They have everything to gain by this, of course. Cheaper labor costs mean more profits for them. Okay, fine. Worse working conditions, no environmental regulations, no factory regulations that inhibit them from using toxic materials in the course of production, poisoning their own workers, as they do on such a lavish scale, even in the United States. You see, the trade union movement in the United States is not even sufficiently environmentally conscious in terms of internal plant pollution. Remember how many workers in the United States are exposed to carcinogenic substances in the very process of working in plastics and chemical industry and mining, whatever you like. So I'm shocked. And I have nothing but contempt for people who make statements like that. Although I understand why the Wall Street Journal might make a claim like that. Sure.
It's a typical view that the government and corporations reformed themselves, giving workers better working conditions, health care, better vacation, etc. You see it in the school history books. Could you go into the real struggle that took place? It wasn't top-down reform.
I've been in the labor movement, the industrial workers movement, by which I mean the United Electrical Radio Machine Shop Workers as a foundryman, during the late 30s and early 40s. I've worked for General Motors, God's gift to America, for, 4 or 5 years. Putting it all together in various other places and factories that I've worked in, and fairly enlightened areas where trade union consciousness was high, like New York City or the New York metropolitan area. After all this experience, I can say with absolute certainty that, and sitting in on negotiations, trade union, that's an experience one should somehow have conveyed, you know what I mean? One movie that gets close to conveying it is that movie Roger and Me about General Motors. I have yet to see the day when capitalists on almost any level have been enlightened, so enlightened as to give one damn about the workers that they employ. One damn. There are little cheap pretensions. I worked, for example, in a foundry where I can say the dust from the, molding dust was so thick that you thought you were in an old-time London fog. You couldn't see more than about, give or take 6 feet beyond you, and then afterward, everything looked like it was a cloudy outline. We were breathing in cancer-causing substances. I'm telling you that right now. Apparently, somewhere along the way, the state of New Jersey, because the plant was a foundry located in the state of New Jersey, had required that there be a ventilating system to draw out this dust and bring in only relatively fresh air. You couldn't completely remove it. And that ventilating system was in total disrepair. It was not working. And additionally, and most people are not familiar with foundries, particularly the old-time foundries where you work with molten iron that is at least 600 degrees Fahrenheit, in order for it to acquire that liquid form, at least, literally burns you, through any kind of protection you may have. And on the other hand, your back freezes because they have to open these huge doors to let air come in. Otherwise, the place would literally explode. You know, I've seen working conditions that horrible in which, as a union negotiator, because we were rank and file negotiators, you see, we worked on our job, and then when we had union work, we'd get paid by the union, taking off time in behalf of our workers. I was a shop steward and a union secretary. So I was involved in negotiations with, quotes, management. And there was nothing I could say to the owners of this corporation that would induce them to restore the ventilating system and to, in some way, prevent the workers from coming down with pneumonia, minimally the flu, certainly colds, because of the uneven temperature of facing molten iron with your, in one way, and then being frozen by the winds coming through the open doors in the wintertime. And so there was nothing I could do to get these capitalists to so much as give a damn about the workers in this plant. I can say from my own experiences that I've seldom seen any humane attitude on the part of a capitalist. For all the garbage one hears about these people giving grants through NPR or PBS, or they love to flaunt as Ford is interested in quality, and General and DuPont is concerned with better things for people through chemistry. That was one of their slogans. At the same time, working with carcinogenic substances and exhibiting a total indifference, showing a total indifference to the welfare of the workers. The workers were nothing more than a resource to be exploited as ruthlessly as any other resource, for example, that a lumberman would have. Everywhere along the way, timber companies, everywhere along the way you had to beat them down on the most elementary decencies of life. Quality of bathroom, quality of air, quality of temperature, whatever you want, kind of temperature you had. To believe for one moment that without labor unions around, and hopefully labor unions, unlike mafia-controlled labor unions, truly concerned with the workers, these people would just... we would be back to the 1830s or 1840s where people would work 12, 14 hours a day, including children, and would die prematurely. American longevity figures would alter drastically if there weren't some forces restraining them, largely the product of trade union struggles. And these trade unions had to gain recognition and to have an impact on society through the bloodiest kind, the most painful kind of struggles that you can possibly imagine. Memorial Day Massacre, which the CIO in 1937, this is a personal memory, tried to bring a trade union recognition to Republic Steel, one of these really pernicious little steel outfits. I'm talking of 1937, the end of May 1937. They shot 30 workers in the back, unarmed workers who were not even involved in a confrontation with them. Police, Chicago police did that, and quite a few died. They were shot in the back and quite a few died. The pictures were so horrible that even though the whole event was thoroughly captured on film, they wouldn't dare show more than the most harmless incidents. One had to go to a special theater to see the whole footage of how these people were shot in the back for demanding a trade union recognition of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee of the CIO by Republic Steel. Let people turn to books like, Jeremy Brecker's book Strike, or Louis Adamick's book Dynamite, to get a picture of what working conditions were like. And I remember before the United Automobile Workers organized GM, workers who had been in this plant that I worked in before that organization took place, before the UAW was acknowledged by General Motors, the United Automobile Workers, in the 1930s. Workers told me their working conditions, and I was horrified. The plant felt it was free, for example, to ask workers to show up at 7 o'clock in the morning, work 2 hours, go home, come back again at 1 o'clock when they needed them, work 3 hours, go home, and maybe for all I know, if my memory is correct, ask them to come again for another 2 hours. So that, workers just, the greater part of 14 hours was consumed by resting up and waiting to be called to the plant in order to work and then to be sent home to be called back again, all within a 24-hour span. The UAW finally made the job compact. You had to show up at 8 and you left, give or take, 5 o'clock, okay? You had X amount of time for lunch, and finally you could get coffee breaks and so on and so forth. So people don't realize in crossing picket lines today, organized by legitimate trade unions, that is regular trade unions, in putting down trade unions, they don't realize what working conditions would be like today if it were up to the enterprise, specifically the capitalist, if he, and generally it's a he, had his way. And the contempt with which workers were treated, the humiliation they had to suffer. One of the main reasons why the airline hostesses went out on strike recently at American Airlines is because they were being humiliated by the bosses and by the managers. I cut out an article in the New York Times which indicated the extent to which they were being degraded as human beings. And many, the majority, of course, being women, were humiliated. It wasn't just, they didn't go out because they wanted simply higher wages. They wanted to be treated like human beings, and they were not. And I can tell you this was the case everywhere in the many different factories that I worked in over the course of at least the first half of my life. Now, bring in a trade union international, equalize the wages everywhere, and then let's talk about the competitive advantages of American industry over that of other industries.
You mentioned 2 books, Dynamite and Strike.
Yeah.
If you were going to suggest some other works for people to read...
Oh, there are many labor histories. One has only to... these are just histories that I'm personally very familiar with. I've even forgotten the titles of The History of American Labor, various experiences of workers that have been put into book form, recollections and so on and so forth, of great struggles in which... Republic Steel bought a fortune in ammunition and guns during the famous CIO organizing drives of the 1930s. The La Follette, at the time Robert La Follette, one of the populist Midwestern senators, I believe, held hearings on the extent to which employers, major corporations, were buying guns, ammunition, tear gas, you name it, in order to fight back trade unions that were relatively disarmed. Most of the workers generally could only fight back with the planks on which they carried their banners or their placards. So there was wanton violence on the part, a terrible and terrifying violence on the part of the corporations. I lived through that whole period and can attest to it. I'm horrified that people today can look at trade unions as something that should disappear or that interfere with their affluence.
Alexander Berkman, in response to the Homestead lockout, shot Henry Clay Frick. I was talking with someone last night, and they reminded me that this type of political activity seems to have disappeared, resorting to violence for political propaganda. Is that a useful tool? Violence?
Well, most of the violence that I'm familiar with that occurred among the workers that I ever saw or read about was generally resistance. It was the violence that was being inflicted on them. This was especially true in the coal mining areas where there was a good deal of violence. Like Harlan County was called Bloody Harlan County. Well, what recourse did the workers have? Many of them living in valleys, largely isolated from cities, and in those days, back in the 30s, you had a great deal of rural isolation. What recourse did many of these Harlan County miners have? They were coal miners. But to pull out their rifles when, in point of fact, the companies essentially were hiring assassins to kill labor organizers, you know. They'd ambush them. These assassins would ambush them at night and just execute them. Or what we would say very bluntly was lynch them, because not only were blacks lynched in great numbers during those years, but white labor organizers in particular. That whole story has to be recovered again and shown to young people, the valiant struggles and dangers that union organizers were involved in and confronted at different times. One of the tragedies of a major documentary called The Great Depression, which recently appeared in, I think, a 7-hour series, lacks. One of the tragedies about that is that it lacks, that 7-hour documentary about the Great Depression, is that it lacks a full and adequate account of the hazards, the dangers, adequate account of the dangers that were that labor organizers and workers confronted when they tried to establish trade unions. It's a very, unfortunately, toothless, more toothless than it should be, documentary, despite the praise it has received. But I wish that had been conveyed.
Speaking of films and documentaries, last year a film came out about Jimmy Hoffa and his participation in labor unions. Can you talk about that and the relation between unions and the mafia?
Yeah, briefly, and I'll take one example specifically, the Teamsters Union. Most people do not know that the most important Teamster local was established in Minneapolis by the Trotskyists. And I knew some of them. Farrell Dobbs, and I wish I could recall some of their names again, but by Trotskyists in Minneapolis. And in 1934, they called a general strike, and they were one of the strongest unions in the Midwest, as I said, in Minneapolis, because they essentially controlled the truckers who radiated out of Minneapolis to different states as they drove their vehicles across state lines and kept on giving out union propaganda, you see. And Jimmy Hoffa understudied them. He studied people like Dobbs, and there were a group of brothers who were Trotskyists and saw what their activity was. They developed things like flying squads, which were, to the best of my knowledge, unknown until their organizing drives were initiated in the early 1930s. Flying squads meant shutting down various terminals, and in the case of mines, that was picked up by the miners also, shutting down coal mines by putting pickets around them when the workers themselves didn't come out in full force. And Hoffa understudied them. And later on, he began to play games with the mafia, partly to gain control of the union, and then began to racketeer with them, so far as I can judge. This, I suspect, may have also happened with the International Longshoremen's Union, which on the East Coast, and the mafia did penetrate a number of unions. I by no means believe that the mafia penetrated the trade union movement as such. Consider such remarkable trade unions as the longshoremen that Harry Bridges led and called the General Strike in San Francisco of 1934. Really incredible action. On the West Coast, I don't believe that union was tainted at all by the mafia. I know that the Automobile Workers Union was not at all tainted by the mafia. I doubt that many great internationals were not tainted by the mafia. The mafia generally worked its way into locals and rarely into internationals, taking control of locals and using extortionist techniques to call strikes or to call off strikes, you know what I mean, and lending money very frequently to employers in the clothing industry, for example, garment industry, I don't believe that the mafia, however, really penetrated into major and classically militant trade unions like the United Mine Workers, as I indicated, the UAW, United Automobile Workers, United Electrical Radio Machine Workers, Textile Workers, and so on and so forth. I believe that that has been overplayed, although there's no denying the fact that mafia penetration did occur in certain specific locals in more cases than not, that is specific locals rather than internationals. The only international that I know of, I could be wrong, of course, but I can only speak from my own knowledge that the mafia managed to get involved in was the Teamsters. But before the early, this only occurred after the general strike that was called by the Teamsters in Minneapolis in 1934, and in the main, during the Second World War. Because what happened was that Franklin D. Roosevelt, in order to break the Trotskyist control of the Teamsters in Minneapolis, had the Trotskyist leaders thrown into jail for subversion because they were opposed to the war, and the mafia moved right in. Dan Tobin and the rest of them. I'm not saying, I don't know about Tobin himself as being a mafioso. I think he was, but that's a matter of opinion. But Jimmy Hoffa and the like. But I don't believe that the trade union movement has been criminalized anywhere to the extent that I think that the entrepreneurs have been criminalized. They're really gangsters. They are their own industrial mafia.
Last question. Do you think the strike as a form of worker protest is soon going to be a thing of the past?
I hope not. That's all I can say is that I hope not. It's an important form of direct action. What concerns me more than anything else is the extent to which the trade union movement, and rank-and-file movements in particular, can interact with each other to both bypass the professional labor leaders, many of whom, by the way, now don't even go into factories, plants, or whatever, but go straight from college into trade union positions. I'm appalled by that there can be trade union leaders, relatively young ones, who've had no labor experience in plants. But my deepest concern would be that the trade union movement would become too professional. The disappearance of you see, the strike weapon doesn't depend simply upon government legislation granting this or that right to the strikers. It depends, first of all, on a very strong sense of solidarity within the labor movement. For example, I believe that strike should have been called to support the women, largely women, hostesses, or whatever their name may be at any particular time. What are they? They have some other names. Stewardess? Well, whatever. I think that other unions should have gone out and supported them. I think that, well, I'm glad that the pilots union didn't, because it simply cost American Airlines more money to fly empty planes. That was okay. But I think they should have gotten broad labor support. And I remember a time when people, the customers of these airlines and factories and corporations were sufficiently trade class conscious, let's put it that way, never to cross the picket line. I, to this very day, would find it impossible to cross the picket line. And I remember a time when some movie projectors, I'm speaking way back in the early days of the Depression, like 1932 and 33, went out on strike in a local movie theater in my neighborhood. And how the whole neighborhood, it wasn't just a question of, there were only two projectionists up there, okay, and they went out on strike. So not only was the theater empty, but the whole neighborhood came out in support, militant support and defense of these two movie projectors, or projectionists, I think is what they're called. And like there were 1,000 people who literally formed a huge picket line, a crowd that prevented the theater from functioning, and they had to close it down, and finally reach an agreement with these two projectionists. That was the feeling of labor solidarity that existed in the New York that I remember back in the 1930s. And I'm sorry to see a consciousness developing right now that shows more sympathy for the corporations, even though that consciousness may even exist among workers who have benefited greatly from trade unions, but then have retired afterward. I'm very sorry to see a consciousness emerge right now that blames big labor as though labor is big, and labor bosses as though labor is the only thing that produces bosses, but not General Motors. You understand, the U.S. Steel or DuPont Chemical and whatever you like. I'm very sorry to see that disappear, and I regard that as a terrible regression in consciousness.
Thanks very much, Murray Bookchin.
You're welcome.